What if I told you that the same guy who ran a global sex trafficking ring helped pay the salaries of the people who write Bitcoin's code? Yeah, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's in the files. Here's what nobody's saying out loud. Jeffrey Epstein put $3 million into Coinbase back in 2014. He funneled money to MIT's Media Lab, and some of that cash ended up paying Bitcoin developers when the Bitcoin Foundation was basically broke. And now, 2 years after these files started getting unsealed, we're supposed to have this big national conversation about whether crypto is fundamentally corrupt. But I don't think that's the right question. I spent the last week going through the actual disclosures, not the headlines, not the Twitter threads, the actual DOJ records, the MIT archives, the transaction logs. And what I found isn't what you'd expect. Because this isn't really a story about Bitcoin being dirty. It's a story about how money works when you have enough of it, and how the exact same system that let Epstein move $1 billion through JP Morgan is the one now clutching pearls about 3 million in crypto. Let's start with what we know for sure. December 2014. Coinbase raises $75 million in a Series C round. Andreessen Horowitz is in, DFJ is in, and buried in there, through an LLC called IGO, Jeffrey Epstein puts in just over 3 million. That's 4% of the round. It's not even close to a controlling stake. By February 2018, he's already sold half of it for $15 million. 10 times return, clean exit. Now here's where it gets interesting. In 2015, Epstein donates $850,000 to MIT's Media Lab. The lab's director at the time, Joy Ito, takes some of that money and diverts it to something called the Digital Currency Initiative. That initiative? It was funding salaries for Bitcoin core developers. Gavin Andreessen's name shows up in those records. This is during the period when the Bitcoin Foundation, the nonprofit that was supposed to support development, was insolvent, couldn't pay people. So MIT stepped in, and part of that MIT money came from Epstein. Okay, pause. Let me ask you something. Does that make Bitcoin corrupt? Because I keep seeing this argument online. If the foundational development of Bitcoin was funded by Epstein money, then the whole system is tainted. And I get the emotional logic there. I really do. But let's think through what that actually means. Bitcoin is open source software. Every line of code is public. Every change is reviewed by dozens of independent developers across the world. There is no CEO of Bitcoin. There's no board of directors. Epstein didn't buy influence over the protocol. He couldn't have. That's not how consensus-based development works. What he bought was social proof. See, this is the part that doesn't make it into the Epstein corrupted crypto headlines. The guy wasn't trying to hijack the network. He was doing what every other wealthy predator does. He was buying access to smart people in influential spaces. Silicon Valley in 2014 was obsessed with Bitcoin. If you were an early investor in Coinbase, you got to sit at the table with the Andreessen Horowitzes of the world. You got meetings. You got credibility. You got to be the tech-forward billionaire instead of the guy with a private island and a suspicious number of flights to the Caribbean. This is the exact same playbook he used with Harvard, with the Council on Foreign Relations, with every other institution he touched. Donate money. Get your name on something. Gain proximity to power. And it worked for years. Now let's talk about the traditional banking side, because this is where the narrative completely falls apart. JP Morgan Chase was Epstein's primary bank for 15 years. 15. They processed 4,700 transactions for him. That's over $1 billion in total volume. Not million, billion. And a lot of those transactions were directly tied to his criminal activity. We're talking wire transfers to shell companies, payments to co-conspirators, hush money, the works. Deutsche Bank did the same thing. Took him on as a client, even after JP Morgan finally dropped him in 2013. So here's my question. Where's the front page story about how JP Morgan is fundamentally corrupt? Where's the congressional hearing about shutting down Deutsche Bank because they facilitated sex trafficking? Oh, right. We don't do that. Because we understand, at least implicitly, that a bank processing a transaction doesn't mean the bank endorses the transaction. The system is neutral. It's a tool. Epstein used it. That doesn't mean every dollar in the banking system is blood money. But somehow, when it's Bitcoin, we lose that nuance. Coinbase processes millions of transactions a day. Epstein's $3 million investment didn't give him control over who uses the platform or how the blockchain operates. It gave him a financial return and some social cachet. That's it. Here's another thing. The data on illicit use of crypto, it's way lower than most people think. TRM Labs and Chainalysis both put out reports in 2025 and 2026. Illicit activity as a share of total crypto volume between 0.4% and 1.2%. Compare that to estimates for traditional finance, where the UN Office on Drugs and Crime says 2 to 5% of global GDP is laundered money every year. That's trillions of dollars. Crypto isn't the problem. It's just the new thing. And new things are easy to vilify. But let's steelman the other side for a second, because I don't think everyone raising concerns is wrong. There's a real argument here about privacy and pseudonymity. Bitcoin transactions are public, but they're not tied to your legal name. If you're careful, you can move money without triggering the sane know your customer checks that a bank would require. And yeah, that does make it appealing to people who want to avoid scrutiny. Law enforcement hates this. Chainalysis, which works with the feds to track crypto crime, has been pretty vocal. Pseudonymity makes their job harder. And they're not wrong, it does. But here's the thing. Privacy isn't the same as criminality. The ability to transact without surveillance is a feature, not a bug. It's the same reason we don't require every cash transaction to be reported to the government. Because financial privacy is a right. And the fact that bad people sometimes use that right doesn't mean we should eliminate it for everyone else. You know what Epstein also used? Encrypted messaging apps, private jets, offshore law firms. Should we ban all of those too? Now, there's another layer to this that I think is worth digging into, because it speaks to how narratives get weaponized. In early 2026, there was this viral claim going around that Epstein was part of a Mossad operation to seize control of the Bitcoin network. I'm not exaggerating. People were saying Israel used him as a cutout to infiltrate the code. It got millions of views. It was everywhere. Fact-checkers went through the unsealed files. Zero evidence, not a shred. No link between Epstein and Israeli intelligence in the context of Bitcoin. No indication that any state-level actor was trying to hijack the protocol. But the claim spread anyway, because it fits a certain kind of story people want to believe. The globalist control narrative. The idea that everything is connected, that there's always a puppet master behind the scenes. And look, I'm sympathetic to that impulse. There are conspiracies. Power does coordinate in hidden ways, but not every data point connects. Sometimes a rich predator just makes a smart investment. Sometimes the world is messier and more random than the grand unified theory suggests. Here's what I think is actually happening. The Epstein crypto connection is being used as a cudgel by people who are already hostile to cryptocurrency. Politicians who want stricter regulations. Legacy finance institutions that see crypto as a competitor. Media outlets that get more clicks from scandal than from nuance. There's a bill that got introduced in 2025 called the Genius Act. It's framed as an anti-money laundering measure, but if you read the fine print, it's basically designed to kneecap the pseudonymous features that make crypto useful in the first place. And every time there's a hearing about it, someone brings up Epstein. Do we really want a financial system that guys like him can use? It's a rhetorical trick, because the answer is supposed to be obvious. Of course we don't. But the real answer is more complicated. Because guys like him already use the traditional financial system for decades, with way more money. And we didn't tear that system down. We fined a few banks, passed some new rules, and moved on. So why is the standard different for crypto? I think it's because crypto represents a threat to centralized control. Not in some Alex Jones sense, but in a very practical, boring sense. If you can move value peer to peer without a bank as an intermediary, that's a problem for the institutions that make money off being intermediaries. And it's a problem for governments that rely on financial surveillance to enforce policy. That doesn't mean crypto is perfect. It doesn't mean everyone in the space is acting in good faith. There are scams, there are hacks, there are bad actors. But Epstein investing in Coinbase doesn't indict the technology any more than Epstein flying on a Boeing jet indicts aviation. Let me throw one more thing at you, because I think it's important. There's a gap in the data, a big one. The unsealed files are massive, 3.5 million pages. But there's a section called Dataset 12 that's heavily redacted. Advocates for the Epstein Files Transparency Act have been pushing to get those redactions lifted, because they suspect that's where the real financial stuff is. Crypto wallets, offshore digital holdings, the full scope of how he moved money in the 2010s. We don't have that yet. And until we do, we're working with incomplete information. So here's my prediction. And I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. When Dataset 12 gets released, and it will, eventually, I think we're going to find that Epstein used Bitcoin the same way he used everything else, as a tool, not as the centerpiece of some grand scheme, but as one asset class among many, a hedge, a diversification play. And I think the people who are currently screaming about crypto being fundamentally corrupt are going to quietly move on to the next thing, because the facts won't support the narrative they want, but the damage will already be done. Regulations will be passed, privacy features will be stripped, and the financial surveillance state will have one more tool in its kit. That's the real story here. Not that a bad guy used Bitcoin, but that we're using a bad guy's use of Bitcoin to justify expanding control over everyone else. So yeah, Epstein's name is on a Coinbase investor list. His money paid some developer salaries at MIT. That's all true. But if you think that means crypto is the problem, I'd ask you to zoom out. Look at the full picture. Follow the billion-dollar trail through JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. Look at who benefits from the current narrative. And then ask yourself, are we actually trying to stop people like Epstein? Or are we just fighting over who gets to control the money?